So in the anterior horn, there are so many cells, so many neurons. These include sensory relay neurons, anterior motor neurons, and many interneurons. Okay, so the nerve fibers which are coming out of these motor neurons, they go out via the anterior root and they directly innervate the skeletal muscles, and this is what is called as lower motor neuron. Okay, so this concept of the anterior root is devoted for motor function and the posterior root is particularly devoted for sensory function is called as Bell-Megendie law. That is, in the spinal cord, the dorsal roots are sensory and the ventral roots are motor. This is very important to remember. Now, this is the cross section of the spinal cord. You can see the center egg-shaped structure, that is the grey matter. Surrounding that will be the white matter. Okay, this is the central canal. This is the anterior horn. These two are the anterior horns, and this is the posterior horn. Okay, this is the anterior root of the spinal cord. This is the posterior root of the spinal cord. Here lies the spinal ganglion, dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so the nerve fibers from the periphery, they ascend up and they enter into the posterior root and they go and enter into the dorsal horn. Okay, similarly, the nerve fibers which are arising from the anterior horn cells, there are so many cells in the anterior horn region which are respective for the, there are so many neurons present in this anterior horn region which are responsible for the motor function. Okay, so the nerve fibers arising from these neurons, they leave the spinal cord via this anterior root or the motor root and they serve the function of motor activity. Okay, coming to the anterior horn motor neurons. There are two types of anterior horn motor neurons. Specifically, there are type A alpha motor neurons. Okay, so or simply alpha motor neurons. These are the larger motor neurons, 14 micrometer in diameter, and if you stimulate a single alpha motor neuron, it can subserve the motor function, that is contraction of the muscle. It can elicit the muscle contraction in several hundreds of skeletal muscle fibers. So that single motor neuron along with the fibers of the skeletal muscle supplied by it together, it is called as motor unit. You can see this diagram. This is one alpha motor neuron. The axon arising from this alpha motor neuron is the peripheral nerve actually. Okay, and the single fiber, they supply a group of muscle cells. You can see all these are individual muscle cells. So a single fiber which supplies a group of muscle cells together, they are called as a single motor unit, one motor unit. So this table shows the number of motor units and the muscle fibers devoted per motor unit for various types of skeletal muscle. So the eye muscle has got 1740 units and each unit has got 13 muscle fibers in them. Okay, so one unit serves only 13 muscle fibers. So they are highly innervated. The neural elements devoted for the contraction of the eye muscle is greater. Similarly, for hand muscles, there are 98 units and each unit supplies 110 muscle fibers. Okay, so the hand muscles are involved in highly skillful movements and it should have higher innervation. Okay, consider this upper arm and the lower leg. Upper arm, it's better, 774 units and each unit supplies 210 muscle fibers, whereas in the lower leg, there are 580 units and each unit is having 1720 muscle. So there is sharing of the nerve fibers for different muscle, for a huge number of skeletal muscle fibers. Okay, there is another type of motor neuron present in the spinal cord. They are called as type A gamma motor neuron. These are smaller motor neurons. Their diameter is only 5 micrometer and they go and supply the intrafusal fibers which control the muscle tone. Okay, we will be seeing about this gamma motor neuron and its significance in detail in the further slides. Apart from this alpha motor neuron and the gamma motor neuron, there are 30 times more numerous interneurons present in the anterior horns. These are also very small cells and they are highly excitable. sometimes they have spontaneous activity also. Okay, the main function of this interneurons is, this is the one which is integrating the functions of the spinal cord. This is the one which connects the upper motor neurons which comes from the motor cortex and the lower motor neurons. This is the one which actually balances between excitation and inhibition of the anterior horn cells. Okay, so interneurons are very, very important with respect to the motor function. There is something called as Renshaw cell inhibition. This is nothing but the alpha motor neuron which is present in the anterior gray horns. Its fiber is the one which is called as a peripheral nerve and which directly goes and innervates the muscle fiber, okay, and causes contraction. Whenever the alpha motor neuron is stimulated, it causes muscle contraction. Okay, but at the same time, the alpha motor neuron, while it goes as a peripheral nerve axon, it also gives a collateral branch, and that branch ends in another interneuron. For example, let me draw an alpha motor neuron. So, this is an alpha motor neuron. Okay. So, when it goes, it also gives a branch. This alpha motor neuron will go and innervate the skeletal muscle. Say this is a skeletal muscle fiber. Okay, so this, when alpha motor neuron is excited, this skeletal muscle fiber will get contracted. But it also gives a collateral, and that collateral goes and ends in another small neuron that is called as an interneuron. Here, this situation, this interneuron is also called as Renshaw cell. Okay, so when it goes and stimulates this Renshaw cell, but the Renshaw cell will go and inhibit the alpha motor neuron. So it is nothing but a negative feedback inhibition. This sort of inhibition is seen. I'm just telling you about this Renshaw cell inhibition because Renshaw cell is an interneuron. This is an example of how an interneuron works in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Now, what is a reflex? It's a simple stereotyped motor response to a specific sensory stimulus. Okay, so when a muscle is stretched, it contracts. So the stretch is the stimulus, it's a simple stimulus. Contraction is the response, it's a simple response. That is called as a reflex. Okay, for any reflex, there should be certain elements. Okay, so the entire elements of the reflex is called as reflex arc. For a reflex arc, these are the elements that should be present. Stimulus. The stimulus is the one which should provoke or evoke a response. Okay, so that stimulus should be present and that stimulus should be received by a receptor. The next structure is the receptor. Okay, now this receptor will trigger certain information and that information is actually carried as action potentials via the nerve fibers.